You arrive expecting something ordinary: a placard, a tidy museum case, an explanation written in plain language for the comfort of a hurried tourist. That is the modern logic: neat labels, dates you can read without squinting, artifacts that sit politely behind glass. Yet, in the shadow of that tidy expectation, hidden beneath layers of earth and centuries of polite forgetting, there are places that refuse the tidy story. Picture a cracked map faded with candle wax, ink running like veins across an old sailor's hand. Then imagine that the map points to ruins that don't match any map you were taught in school. That is where this hour begins, at the scene between what we think we know and what the land insists on keeping secret. From the first moment, I promise you this, we will find not only artifacts and measurements, but edges where explanations fray into rumor, where legends press against scientific fact, and where sometimes the objects themselves ask more questions than the researchers who hold them. Listen with that sense of curiosity, because each of these mysteries folds into the next. I will take you to a place where stone markers suggest a web of ancient sea lanes, to valleys where giant bones, whether myth or misidentified paleontological fragments, have been reported more than once, to communities that guard stories of lost navigators like a family secret. We'll consider maps that show continents where there should be ocean, metallurgical anomalies that suggest high-temperature forging centuries before such technologies were supposed to exist, and trade goods found far from their putative sources as if a different set of hands moved them across the world. I'm not here to sell you conspiracy. I'm here to walk you through the evidence, the theories, the counterarguments, and importantly, the human impulse to keep looking. You and I both know how seductive a single unaccountable object can be, the way it gathers attention, the way a compass needle finds north. And by the end, I want us to share something closer to wonder than to certainty. First, a word on method. Archaeology is not a single lens but a choir of methods, stratigraphy humming with its slow rhythms, radiocarbon dating offering numerical approximations that still leave room for interpretation, isotopic analysis whispering about diet and geography, and the brittle, improvisational endeavor of historical inference when written sources are scarce. Add to this the voices of local oral history, the stubborn testimony of landscape, and the occasional outliers, anomalous artifacts, improbable alignments, and you have the stew we're cooking with tonight. We'll be fair to skeptics and generous to the unknown, because both stances are necessary. Skepticism protects us from spinning grand narratives on the basis of a single token. Wonder keeps us from discarding the genuinely baffling. For every site I describe, we will examine the hard facts, dates, materials, measurements, before we slide into the mythic possibilities. I'll tell you what the evidence shows, what different experts have argued, and where the argument thread breaks. At every turn, I'll invite you to imagine walking that fog-choked trail with me, to feel the cold of the stone under your palms, to stand where someone centuries ago might have stood and thought about the same sky. Imagine it, because imagination is not mere diversion here, it is a scholarly tool. When we imagine, we test the plausibility of paths not written down, we breathe life into the silent things, and we remind ourselves that the past was populated by people with messy, complicated lives, not by cartoons pointing to a single cause. Now picture the first of those places, a long, low strip of coastline where the sea has more recently been claimed by storm and sand than by maps. Fishermen here tell a simple story. There used to be stones in the water, markers laid in a line, but the stones are submerged now. In the 20th century, bathymetric surveys hinted at regular alignments beneath the waves. Divers recovered work stone in the shallows and, more surprisingly, shards of pottery with glazing techniques that should not have been present in this latitude until much later. Radiocarbon dates from organic residues on the pottery lean one way, stylistic comparisons lean another. That contradiction is our first taste of the deeper problem. The past rarely reads like a single, neat textbook entry. We'll come back to spoil the certainty of one neat timeline after another. When you step into any of these sites, when you stand where an obsidian blade lay in the dirt, or where a channel cut through loam suggests deliberate engineering, you begin to appreciate scale in a different way. Measurements that sound abstract on paper become sensory when you imagine the hands that made them. A causeway 2 meters broad and a kilometer long changes how you think about labor and social organization. A mastodon rib used as a structural beam in a shelter makes you care how those bones were treated and by whom. Distances between sites, 400 kilometers as the crow flies, translate into months of overland travel or the need for navigational knowledge that some late histories simply do not credit to a given culture. Those gaps between a site's technological signature and the consensus about when such techniques were in use are exactly the kind of cracks where our lost navigator maps might have operated. But let's be clear, not every anomaly means a lost civilization with advanced techniques. Often the ordinary moves slowly into the extraordinary because we lack records, because perishable materials have vanished, or because climate shifted the landscapes and trade routes we thought were fixed. Still, when multiple lines of evidence, chemical signatures linking metals to remote mines, isotopes and shells indicating currents that only existed during a certain climatic window, and a sudden influx of foreign ceramics, come together in the same layer of occupation, the case for sustained long-distance contact strengthens. It forces historians to consider that what we call local might be the terminus of a much longer chain. And that is what makes these stories relevant. They change how we think about human connectivity and memory. When a map fragment suggests routes that crisscross oceans some scholars said were unbridgeable at a given time, you stop asking who got from A to B and start asking how people imagine the spaces between A and B. Maps are not only records, they are arguments about who matters and what lands are worth counting. Every segment I bring you tonight will follow a similar arc, a short teaser that names the place and droops a hook into the reader's mind. Hard data and dates, competing theories, a mythic layer, an imaginative invitation, and a reflection tying the site back to human curiosity. You will not see lists or headings. This is spoken word script, after all, meant to be listened to in one sitting. That said, each mystery is a room in a house that, when you step into it, smells different. Some smell of salt and iron, others smell of old leather and burned resin, others smell like earth and the quiet of undisturbed graves. The final room, our wrap-up, will close those doors gently, not to seal them, but so we can remember the architecture of what we've walked through together. Now let me take you to the first named site, and keep your imagination lit. Think of a wind-bent tower of rock etched with lines that don't belong to any script you're familiar with. This place, call it the Mariner's Teeth, along a ragged coast, holds a map not drawn on paper but in stone. The one-sentence tease is simple. Mariner's Teeth, a jagged coastline marked by stone alignments and carved symbols, suggests an intricate coastal navigation system far older than the nautical charts scholars credit to later mariners. The site is remarkable for its repetitive arrangement of standing stones, each carved with shallow grooves that, when lined up, form a sideline to distant headlands. Measurements show the stones were placed with deliberate spacing, 25 to 30 meters apart, a repeat pattern that persists for nearly 6 kilometers along the shore. Embedded within some stones are small ceramic inlays that, when analyzed, contain trace elements suggesting a kiln technology not typically associated with the local culture dated to roughly 1200 BC. That is the first oddity, an apparent technological leap visible in ceramic temper and glaze composition that migrates differently from the expected local typology. Archaeologists first documented the site in the late 19th century as a curiosity. The stones were dismissed then as boundary markers or ritual monuments. It was only with the advent of systematic coastal surveys in the 1970s that researchers noticed alignments pointing beyond the nearest headland and, more importantly, matching the angle of seasonal currents. A team that surveyed the area in 1981 measured the orientations and found a tight clustering aligned to the azimuth of a seasonal swell that appears only during the late autumn storms. Why would a people mark a coastline in such a way? One theory holds that the markers were practical, aim points for novice navigators returning to a treacherous harbor. The grooves might have held slats of wood or cloth that, when wet, indicated wind direction. Another theory leans into the ritual. The stones are processional, part of an initiation route where young sailors were ritually taught the names of headlands and the stories of the currents. Here's where it gets tricky. Either theory fully accounts for the ceramic inlays with the unusual firing traces. Those trace elements point to a metal-rich clay matrix and evidence of salt glazing techniques that many assume were absent in that region before the first millennium BC. Still, for all the evidence, we must admit the dating is messy. Organic material found in the mortar-like binding between stones returned radiocarbon dates centering around 1200 BC, give or take 80 years. A different sample, taken from deeper deposits where shell middens overlapped with stone settings, returned dates several centuries later. Now, let's be fair, coastal processes can complicate stratigraphy. A storm can bury and re-expose deposits, mixing contexts across centuries. But the alignment of the stones with currents, combined with the ceramics and the oral histories of local fishing communities that speak of a path of the teeth, raises the possibility of a long-lived navigational tradition, updated and adapted over generations. Imagine then the mythic overlay, fishermen who tell of a phantom lighthouse keeper who walked between the stones at dawn, carrying a bone lantern, guiding spirits back to the sea. Add to that reports, sporadic and poorly documented, of long bones found in the collapsed dunes nearby. Some villagers called them the bones of giants, a folkloric tendency we will meet again in other sites, where large bones transform into mythic giants in the telling. We should consider trade evidence too. Small metal beads recovered from inland layers near the site contain isotopic signatures pointing to ore sources several hundred kilometers away, or that, according to conventional histories, was not exploited until centuries after the earliest dates at Mariner's Teeth. That could mean one of several things. Itinerant traders arrived early, the isotopic signature is being misread, or there was a now-lost local smelting tradition that archaeologists have yet to document. Multiple competing theories here are all plausible and none are decisive. One coastal historian proposes that Mariner's Teeth was a node in an emergent network of short-hop seafarers who traded along the littoral and steadily passed down a body of navigational knowledge, maps, in a sense, encoded in stone because perishable maps don't survive salt and sun. Another scholar cautions against grand narratives, suggesting instead that isolated technical experiments, like the anomalous glazing, could reflect a temporary influx of craftsmen or a localized innovation that wasn't widely adopted. We still don't know which is right, or whether a combination of both better reflects a messy, patchwork history. Picture yourself walking that foggy trail at dawn, the air cold and salt-scented. A gull wheels above. Your hand brushes a carved groove and you imagine ribs of wood sliding into place in the grooves, forming a visual code for a returning captain. You can see the currents aligning with the stone line, faint in the early light, and your mind, trained by centuries of nautical charts, wants to place a name on it. But names change. The people who placed those stones erased and were erased by time. Their technical skills might have been modest or extraordinary in ways we cannot yet quantify. The reflective insight here is modest. Mariner's Teeth asks us to redefine navigational knowledge not as ink on vellum, but as cultural practice encoded in landscape. Navigation is more than instruments and written charts. It is memory impressed into place, into grooves, into stones, into the stories fishermen tell their children. From Mariner's Teeth we move inland, metaphorically, for now, to a river valley where terraces rise in steps and where geometric earthworks mark an otherwise pastoral landscape. We will return to that valley next, and when we do, we will find unexpected pottery, strange alignments, and a legend about a navigator who could read the stars like a ledger. For now, hold this. The first site shows how a map can be not a paper object but a series of practices embedded in land and sea. It is already telling us that maps are many things: narrative, ritual, practical engineering. Keep that multiplicity in mind because the next mysteries will test it in other registers, on hills, in caves, beneath sand. We still don't know. The Starteller Terraces, a river valley carved into stepped fields where rows of earthen benches align with a cluster of engraved bedrock panels, offers a single-sentence tease that announces a problem as simple and stubborn as a horizon. Terraces and star maps that should not belong to the same century appear together, forcing us to reconsider whether navigation was sometimes etched into the earth itself. Walk with me into the valley. Imagine terraces stacked like a giant staircase, each bench between 2 and 4 meters deep, running for nearly 3 kilometers along the river bend and climbing 40 to 60 meters above the floodplain. Excavations begun in the 1990s, intensified by a larger international survey in 2010, revealed compacted floors, post holes, and a remarkably uniform fill that suggests deliberate terracing rather than accidental accumulation. Radiocarbon dates taken from charcoal in the terrace fill produced a cluster centering around 950 BC to 780 BC, placing the main phase of terracing in the late Iron Age for this region, contemporaneous with a patchwork of small polities historically considered inland farmers rather than seafarers. But carved into the bedrock at the highest terrace, an exposed, wind-polished slab roughly 3 meters by 2 meters, are a set of shallow grooves and dot-like punctures that, when plotted, form an arrangement strikingly similar to celestial charts used for coastal navigation. Now, that is the heart of the mystery. Why would an inland agrarian community, at nearly 60 meters above the river, spend effort carving what looks like an astronomical navigation aid into a field? Archaeologists catalogued the pottery from the terraces and found it overwhelmingly local in manufacture, hand-built, burnished ware with cone-rim motifs typical of the valley's late proto-historic tradition. Yet mixed into the fill were a handful of thin, wheel-burnished sherds with a fine coppery slip, early evidence of wheel-made ceramics pushing into rural contexts centuries earlier than expected. Nearby, fragments of a wooden plank, remarkably preserved in an anaerobic pocket, were radiocarbon dated to about 920 BC and yielded traces of pitch and resin consistent with ship caulking compounds used on seagoing craft elsewhere along the coast 200 kilometers away. Isotopic analysis of human bone recovered from a terrace burial zone told another surprising story. Several individuals had marine isotope signatures inconsistent with a purely riverine diet. Their protein sources included shellfish and saltwater fish whose habitats lie beyond the estuary. These strands of evidence, terraces dated to the late 1st millennium BC, small quantities of maritime material culture, and dietary isotopes suggesting coastal resources, form an awkward knot when you assume a tidy shoreline/inland separation. But here's where it gets tricky. The carved panels atop the terraces are not merely decoration. The patterns of dots and lines correspond remarkably well with the positions of certain bright stars and constellations as seen from the latitude of the valley during a narrow celestial window centered around roughly 1000 to 900 BC, according to astronomical retrocalculations. In other words, the carved chart appears to be a star map key to a specific time frame, a map usable for navigation under certain seasonal skies. Scholars split into two camps. One argues for a pragmatic interpretation. These are agricultural star maps, calendrical devices to time planting and harvesting, a mnemonic for seasonal labor. After all, agrarian societies commonly use the heliacal rising of stars to coordinate sowing cycles. The grooves could be ritualized guides for collective labor, and the marine signatures might reflect periodic pilgrimage to the river mouth to trade, fish, or salt, bringing back artifacts and techniques, including caulking compounds. The other camp, more provocative, suggests these panels were used by itinerant navigators, perhaps seasonal fishing captains, who spent summers inland and carved mnemonic aids where they could be inspected and taught. This implies a social arrangement in which navigational knowledge flowed inland, captains teaching inland kin, or guild-like networks where coastal and inland groups intermarried and exchanged craft skills. Still, for all the evidence, spatial logic balks. How do seasonal seafarers justify carving crucial navigational aids high above the floodplain where fogs collect and nights can be colder and less revealing of the horizon? Why not place such aids near the shore? Another theory synthesizes the anomalies into a single, more daring narrative. The valley was a node in a transregional circuit of knowledge transmission, what one historian called a cultural highway, where ideas moved faster than bulk goods. In this view, the terraces functioned as a practical agricultural system and as a training ground, where young men and women learned not only how to tend the soil but also how to read the stars and the currents via seasonal instruction from visiting navigators. Think of it as an inland university with a practical, experimental curriculum. Those wooden planks with pitch might be remnants of small riverine boats adapted for upriver travel, vessels capable of a few days' travel to the estuary and back, carrying not commodities alone but people and knowledge. Yet skeptics point to the possibility of contamination. Pitch and resin compounds can be transported by trade in non-nautical contexts, Marine isotopes could reflect consumption of riverine species with anomalous baselines, and the star patterns could be coincidental, a pareidolia in stone that we read as chart because we are primed to see maps. We must be fair, human beings are pattern-seeking animals. Sometimes we see intentionality where none exists. But there is more. Oral traditions collected from older residents of nearby hamlets tell of a figure called the Starteller, a navigator who knew the names of the sky like a ledger. A phrase repeated with slight variation across 3 different modern languages in the region. The Starteller is said to arrive in late autumn, stay a few weeks, teach the youth songs about currents and constellations, and then leave before the river ice forms. The phrasing is evocative. Ledger suggests systematic knowledge, perhaps even mnemonic lists used by sailors to recall routes and hazards. Folklorists caution that oral traditions can conflate centuries and compress multiple figures into one archetype. Still, the concordance between the oral record and the material hints at a persistent cultural practice. Now let us be mythic for a moment. In local retellings, the Starteller was rumored to travel with a companion of extraordinary height. A man taller than 2 men, whose bones, according to legend, were sometimes unearthed during terrace repair and described in accounts from the 17th century as huge and as if belonging to giants. That motif, giants appearing in folklore to fill gaps of physical memory, resonates with other sites we'll visit, where large bones become narrative anchors, turning ambiguous finds into mythic proof of ancient giants or monsters. Picture yourself walking up one of those terraces at dusk. The air is thin, river fog settles low in the valley. You lay your palm across a groove in the bedrock and trace the pattern of dots with your fingertip. Imagine that a teacher once stood here, pointing a carved stick at the grooves, aligning them with the bright star of the season, uttering a name that has since been lost. Imagine a small group of youths around the teacher, their breath pluming in the cold, repeating the names in call and response, learning both the timing of sowing and the angle to hold a reed in a skiff to keep a course when fog swallows the sun. It is an intimate image, soft, practical, and human, and it tempers the more sensational possibilities with the smell of sweat and lamp oil. Still, for all that vividness, the carved panel begs a larger question about the scale and directionality of knowledge flow in pre-modern societies. We assume coasts taught inland, but the evidence here suggests more of a two-way valve. Yet technological anomalies press in too. Microscopic residue analysis of the grooves revealed traces of a fine metallic powder consistent with bronze filing, perhaps an accidental byproduct of tool maintenance, or, as some have controversially suggested, deliberate inlaying of metal into grooves to increase reflectivity during starlit instruction. If bronze dust was used intentionally, then the grooves could have once caught starlight in a way that sharpened their visibility at night, a practical trick for teaching under poor visibility. Bronze filings imply access to metalworking that the local ceramic typology didn't suggest at that level. It implies either a local metalworker of unusual skill or visiting artisans. Trade goods recovered in small numbers, glass beads of northern manufacture, a single spindle whorl of a type associated with coastal workshops, complicate the picture further. Taken together, these data suggest a seasonal, probably recurring intersection between inland agricultural communities and coastal maritime specialists, a kind of cultural exchange that maps were part of, though not always as paper artifacts. This forces us to broaden our definition of a map, to include embodied instruction, mnemonic rock panels, and perhaps even choreographed labor sequences, ways in which a community encodes navigational knowledge into daily life. Now, let's be fair and look at the counterarguments in detail. Critics emphasize that astronomical retrocalculations are sensitive to precession and calendar drift. Small shifts in star positions over centuries can make a pattern look purposeful when the match is loose. The carved panel's punctures might align with bright stars at one epoch but not another, and relying on one epoch to make interpretive claims can be misleading. Moreover, stratigraphic complexity in terrace fill, where older artifacts can be redeposited into later contexts, means that radiocarbon dates might cluster incorrectly, especially where collapsing bank materials or human activity reworks sediments. Some argue that a more conservative reading sees terraces as agricultural innovations with occasional coastal influences. Seafarers did come inland, yes, But they did not turn the valley into a school of navigation. Instead, they participated in an exchange network where ideas, including basic astronomical lore useful for both planting and sailing, were traded as casually as salt and cloth. Still, for all the evidence and counter-evidence, you can't escape a central truth. This valley shows interconnectedness in layers: dietary, technological, ritual. The pattern is not decisive proof of a navigator school housed in the terraces, but it is a plausible way to integrate otherwise dissonant findings. The reflective insight here requires tempering grand narratives with an appreciation for how ordinary life functions as information technology. Families, apprentices, and seasonal workers are pragmatic conduits of knowledge. A carved panel is then not only a map in any narrow sense, it is a mnemonic stage directing embodied learning, a physical locus for shared memory. What matters for our Lost Navigator maps? Theme is that maps can be performative. They teach as they are read and alter behavior through ritualized repetition. When you accept that, the carved panel atop the terraces becomes less anomalous and more like an instruction manual written into the land itself. Before we leave the valley, consider the ethical dimension. When we unearth human remains, carved stones, and the delicate trace evidence that allows isotopic and residue analysis, we are disturbing the material traces of living social worlds. Local communities sometimes object to excavations, and there are records of disputes over terrace ownership and the removal of carved stones in earlier centuries. In the 1970s, for example, a poorly documented export of one bedrock panel to a private collection sparked protests that led to new heritage protections in the region. It took decades before trust was rebuilt and collaborative research resumed. That history of contestation is a reminder that archaeological interpretation does not occur in a vacuum. The politics of who owns the past shape what can be said about it. Researchers must therefore triangulate not only dates and isotopes but also contemporary values and descendant claims when making bold claims about navigation and maps. Still, for all the evidence, we have not resolved the core riddle. Why is a star chart present in a terraced agricultural valley at a time when coastal navigation is supposed to have been localized elsewhere? The simple answer: trade, seasonal travel, and shared knowledge explains many parts without fully satisfying the sense of surprise the site provokes. We still don't know whether the terraces were the site of a formal pedagogy in navigation, whether the carved panels were mnemonic devices for farming that were later co-opted by mariners, or whether we are misreading coincidental marks. We still don't know if the starteller was a single charismatic figure or an archetype sculpted by generations of storytellers to account for a recurring but diffuse pattern of cultural exchange. We still don't know whether the bronze filings were utilitarian or symbolic, whether marine isotopes signal routine coastal access or sporadic feasting events, and whether the wooden planks with pitch indicate an indigenous upriver boat tradition or the casual presence of coastal craft. The valley gives us possibilities rather than answers, and in those possibilities we find not frustration but an invitation to imagine connection in new ways. The Cartographer's Cave, a limestone hollow tucked under a ragged cliff where waves used to lap before the coastline shifted, reveals a one-line tease that feels like a dare. A subterranean gallery of engraved coastline lines and compass-like glyphs suggests someone once sketched sea routes on stone long before ink and vellum were the default media for maps. Step inside that cave with me. The entrance is narrow, just wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder, and it opens into a vaulted chamber roughly 20 meters long and 8 meters across, with smooth, water-polished walls that catch the light of a torch like a forward-facing map surface. Along the north wall are a dozen shallow engravings, lines, dotted sequences, concentric arcs, and a repeated motif that resembles a rudimentary compass rose oriented consistently across panels. Measurements taken by survey teams in the 1990s placed the largest engraved panel at 3.6 meters long and 1.2 meters high. The lines measure between 5 and 20 millimeters in depth, cut with a degree of regularity that suggests deliberate, controlled tools. Now, to the punchline that sparked both excitement and skepticism. Some of the coastal outlines engraved on these panels correspond remarkably to Paleo shorelines reconstructed for the region at around 1500 to 1000 BCE, before a series of post-glacial transgressions and tectonic nudges altered the coast. If those engravings are indeed contemporaneous with the occupation layers near the cave mouth, layers radiocarbon dated to between 1400 and 900 BC, then we are looking at a cognitive feat, individuals who remembered and encoded coastal geography on interior rock long after the sea itself had moved. Archaeologists first documented the cave in a hurried report after local spelunkers reported old drawings in the 1970s. The initial response was cautious. Graffiti abounds in caves the world over, and the possibility of modern forgery is always present. But careful stratigraphic work at the site uncovered a sequence of hearths, shell deposits, and tool scatters that sit in stratified relation to the engraved panels. Charcoal samples from hearths directly adjacent to the panels produced radiocarbon dates clustering about 1250 BC, with a statistical spread that suggests repeated occupation rather than a single event. Associated finds included chipstone microliths, several polished bone toggles likely used for net fastening, and small fragments of a copper-iron amalgam whose manufacture technique remains debated. Microstratigraphy revealed that mineral accretions had formed within the carved grooves, thin laminations of calcite that often take centuries to accumulate, providing a natural, geologically anchored counterweight to forgery claims. In short, the cave looked authentic. Human-used space, tool debris, hearths, and carvings enmeshed in a sequence that radiocarbon and mineral growth together suggested considerable antiquity. Now here's where it gets tricky. When the engraved coastlines were overlaid on modern maps and then on paleocoastline reconstructions derived from sediment cores and isostatic rebound models, several striking correspondences emerged. A promontory marked in the cave aligns with a submerged platform identified by sonar surveys 2 nautical miles offshore. A narrow channel engraved between 2 islands matches the bathymetric trace of a drowned strait excavated in core samples and dated by microfossil assemblages to roughly 1300 BC. Those matches are improbable to the point of being exciting. Yet we must be fair, reconstruction models have inherent uncertainties. Shorelines shift, bays silt up, and islands appear only to be swallowed again. Even so, the cave engravings do not look like generic coastlines. They look mapped, scaled, and annotated. The repeated compass motif is particularly provocative. Its 4-lobe design, when oriented against true north determined by magnetic surveys in the cave, yields an alignment that would have been accurate in the cave's occupation window only if compasses existed then, an anachronism that sent some scholars on the hunt for alternative explanations. Competing theories proliferated. One camp argued for a pragmatic, local explanation: fishers or mariners, stranded inland by a long-ago shift in the coastline, engraved memories of the sea on the cave wall to preserve knowledge for future generations, a mnemonic of hazards and safe passages. In this framework, the compass-like glyphs are not navigational instruments in the magnetic sense but schematic aids, a stylized representation of cardinal directions as taught in oral seafaring pedagogy. The engraved coastlines, then, are not precise cartography but memory maps, indexical, schematic, and sufficient for oral teaching. Another, more radical camp proposed that the cave preserves evidence of advanced navigational thought, proto-cartography, that might have used observational methods to register bearings and distances. Proponents of this view pointed to incised marks along the floor that aligned with sight lines over the cave lip to distant peaks. They suggested that early navigators used these side lines as baselines to chart angles of departure and approach, encoding the geometries into stone. If so, the cave becomes more than a mnemonic gallery. It becomes a site of active cartographic production. But skepticism cut deeper. Critics emphasized the problem of scale and utility. A map is valuable when it is portable and usable where you need it. Why carve coastlines into a cave that sits high above the flooding plain and would not be visible to a sailor at sea? The answer proffered by defenders, that the cave served as a training hall for seasonal mariners who came inland, meets the objections with counterarguments about time investment and risk. Why carry students inland to teach what could be taught at the shore? That objection is persuasive but not decisive. We must account for cultural reasons. Inland caves often carried ritual weight, and teaching in sacred spaces could have conferred social legitimacy to navigational knowledge, marking it as a guarded craft transmitted through initiation. The cave's acoustics amplify voices and whistles. Its enclosure is a place where songs and chants, useful mnemonic devices, carry better than in a windy harbor. Instruction in a resonant chamber, with carved diagrams, could ingrain knowledge in the body more effectively than on an exposed bluff. The material evidence also complicates the narrative. The copper-iron amalgam fragments are intriguing because metallurgical assays suggest a smelting process that attains higher temperatures and more controlled atmospheres than most regional contemporaries were thought to achieve. If those fragments are indeed products of local metallurgical expertise, then the craft tradition here was sophisticated and could plausibly support the production of tools precise enough to carve the fine grooves we see. However, skeptics counter that such metallurgical evidence often derives from trade, small ingots or tools transported inland, rather than local production. And while the microcalcite layers within the engravings support antiquity, they cannot directly date the time of carving. They only indicate that water and mineral buildup occurred since the carving's exposure. If carvings were made, recut, or cleaned in varying epochs, the accretion record could be complex. Forensic analysis of patina layers suggests multiple episodes of carving and recarving, which could mean the cave's cartographic surface was an active, evolving object used and updated across centuries. The story becomes more charged when oral traditions and early travelogues are considered. A 17th century merchant's diary, an otherwise obscure source that surfaced in a private archive, mentions a cavern where old captains count the sea upon stone, and refers to a rows of directions drawn crude but honored. Anthropologists who examined local oral narratives collected in the 20th century found recurring metaphors. Counting the sea, keeping the ledger, that denote an abstract system of maritime knowledge encoded in non-paper forms. Those metaphors are not proof, but they are suggestive. They map onto the archaeological pattern in a way that makes the cave feel integrated into local cultural memory. Furthermore, accounts from coastal communities mention a seasonal migration of groups from the shore to upland sites for ceremonies, trading, and learning. These migrations coincide with the climatic window when sea conditions were calmer and seafarers could more confidently travel the littoral, lending logistical plausibility to the idea that teaching happened inland during calmer seasons. Now let us slide into the mythic layer, which always makes scientists squint and storytellers smile. Among the cave's local narratives is a persistent tale of a mapkeeper, a solitary figure who tended the engraved walls and who possessed a metal disc used to point the way. A disc sometimes described as shining like polished copper and inscribed with radial lines. In the myth, the mapkeeper is part human, part something else. The disc, in some versions, is said to have magnetic properties that could wake up the lines on the wall when placed at certain points, making them glow. Folklore scholars rightly treat such stories as symbolic artifacts rather than literal history. Yet these tales function as a cultural gloss. They explain why the cave mattered and give a mnemonic narrative for its use. The disc could well be a ritual object used as a pointer or a polished mirror used to catch starlight and throw it across the engravings at particular angles. Practical tricks that could be mythologized into an object with magical agency. Picture yourself crouching in that cave, torch in hand, and imagine a teacher sliding a polished disc along a groove while a group of boys and girls lean in to follow the line with their fingers. The torchlight flickers, the disc gleams, and the teacher's voice, low and rhythmic, assigns a name to each bend, a reef, a promontory, a channel. Imagine the smell of smoke and resin, the chalky tang of calcite under your fingernails, and the patient choreography of pointing and repeating. That mental scene helps demystify the cave's function while preserving its wonder as a social technology. Maps made of memory, maps taught through touch and story. The reflective insight here is that cartography need not be an abstract science of projection and scale only. It can be a performed practice anchored by ritual and pedagogy. In societies where literacy is rare and paper scarce, mapping becomes an embodied craft, and the body, through gesture, song, and repetition, remains the most portable archive of knowledge. Nevertheless, doubts keep jangling at the edges. Some geologists suggest that the cave's alignments with paleoshorelines are selective readings. Commentators, they say, pick out features that match and ignore mismatches. Cognitive bias is real. We love patterns and hate ambiguity. To address that, recent teams have attempted to quantify the correspondences using spatial statistics and blind overlay techniques. They fed the engraved outlines into algorithms and compared the fit against randomly generated coastline models. The results were mixed. Statistically significant fits occurred for certain panels but not across the board, implying that some engravings are intentional depictions while others might be schematic or symbolic with no direct geographic referent. That equivocation is not a defeat, it is a reminder of the human mixture of precision and poetry in mapmaking. Some panels are close to cartography as we define it, others are diagrams, myths, or mnemonic gestures meant to evoke rather than represent. Then there is the controversial claim that the compass-like glyphs betray anachronistic knowledge of Earth's magnetism. Hands-on experiments have been conducted inside the cave, exposing a range of metallic objects to the cave's local magnetic anomalies. The cave sits on a bedrock formation with iron-rich inclusions that can distort magnetic readings. Magnetic north inside the chamber deviates in localized patches. If a polished disc were set down on one of these patches, it might rotate unpredictably, be interpreted as pointing the way, and be incorporated into lore. That mundane explanation softens claims of advanced compass use. Still, we should not undercut the ingenuity of seafarers who long observed environmental cues, wind, swell, birds, cloud patterns, to navigate before magnetic instruments existed. A polished disc used to catch the sun's glint and align a sight line is a device that sits comfortably between ritual object and practical instrument. Trade echoes through the cave's assemblage as well. Small glass beads of northern manufacture, found in layers above the engraved panels and dated to the turn of the first millennium BC, indicate long-distance exchange networks. A carved whale vertebra repurposed as a hammer, found near a hearth, suggests maritime resources were part of domestic economies. The material culture thus paints a picture of connectivity, an inland chamber used by people who, in one way or another, had access to the sea and to goods that came from afar. Whether these connections produced formal mapmaking or an oral tradition supplemented by stone diagrams remains contested, but the intersection of inland ritual space and maritime knowledge is clear enough to complicate simplistic coastal/inland binaries. One of the most humanizing details comes from an osteological analysis of a small burial found in a niche just inside the cave entrance. The bones belonged to a middle-aged woman who had among her grave goods a slender bone awl, a set of net weights, and a tiny carved disc of greenstone, a portable proxy for the larger polished disc in the myths. Isotopic study of her teeth suggests a childhood diet that included coastal shellfish followed by a later life shift to more mixed inland resources, implying she moved from a coastal childhood to an inland adult life, perhaps part of the seasonal migrations or marriage alliances that stitched coastal and inland communities together. The presence of net weights in a cave burial inland is a poignant sign that the identity of a person as mariner or farmer could be intertwined. People carried multiple lifeways within their bodies and in the objects they left behind. In the end, the cave refuses to be neat. It is at once a gallery of possible cartography, a liturgical chamber, a classroom, and a palimpsest of social memory. The most responsible scholarly account must hold these possibilities together and resist the seduction of a single tidy narrative. The cartographer's cave is not definitive proof that Bronze Age sailors carried charts in the way later centuries did, but it is a powerful testament to how humans externalize mental maps into durable media, stone, bone, ritual, story, and then use those externalizations to teach, remember, and bind communities. We still don't know whether the cave's engravings are primarily schematic mnemonics for a vibrant oral tradition, remnants of an inland cartographic school that taught seafaring techniques away from the coast, or an evolving mixture of symbolic, practical, and pedagogical marks updated across centuries. We still don't know whether the disc in the myths had instrumental properties or was a ritual focal point mythologized out of ordinary teaching tools. We still don't know if the matches with paleo shorelines are coincidence, selective perception, or evidence of a remarkably persistent human memory of a lost coast. We still don't know, and perhaps, in a way that honors the cave, that is precisely the point. The Sunken Ledger Atoll, a ring of reefs half sunken and half remembered where inlaid stones and foreign ceramics sit like punctuation marks in tidal sand, offers a one-line tease that reaches for the marvelous. A coral ring stitched with work stone and fragments of maps suggests a maritime ledger, an index of routes and hazards, preserved in reef and rock rather than ink. Imagine approaching the atoll in a small boat as the tide drops. The water slides away in ribbons, revealing a lattice of stones laid in a pattern too regular to be natural, stones bearing grooves filled with a dark, tar-like resin and occasional fragments of thin, pyrite flake shell that catch the light like letters. Bathymetric surveys show the atoll ring enclosing an inner lagoon shallow enough in places to walk across at low tide. The stone placements extend beneath the lagoon floor in courses that measure between 0.7 and 1.4 meters wide, forming repeated loops and spokes for nearly 2 kilometers. Core samples from beneath the inlaid stones returned ages centering between 800 BC and 200 BC, with some deeper deposits hinting at earlier occupation episodes. The temporal spread is broad, but the pattern, the act of deliberately placing work stone into reef structure, repeats across layers, suggesting not a single improvisation but an enduring practice. Excavation dives have recovered shards of ceramics that confound neat typologies, high-fired porcelains of a style that, in conventional chronologies, do not appear in the region until centuries later sit beside coarse, local ware. Small bronze toggles and an unusual bearing device, a ring of carved bone with a central hole, smoothed as if used to sight a bearing, were found lodged between coral branches, coated in mineral deposits that imply long submersion. When microbiological residues in the resin fillings were analyzed, they contained microfossils of algae species that thrive in brackish, lagoonal environments, not open ocean, suggesting the reef labor was intended for use in tidal windows, a practical architecture for an atoll that served as a harbor and a teaching ground. Isotopic signatures in fish bones recovered from midden deposits indicate both reef and pelagic species, implying a community practiced both inshore lagoon fishing and offshore excursions. In short, the material picture is of a literal complex, people who built, visited, and used this atoll repeatedly, embedding functional stonework into the reef itself. The interpretive possibilities expand when you consider the inlaid stones as more than mere breakwaters or ritual markers. Some archaeologists propose that the stones formed a physical chart. The spokes and loops correspond to tidal channels, submerged shoals, and safe anchorages, so that a pilot moving through the system could, at low tide, walk the reef and commit the pattern to memory, an embodied map learned by touch and repetition. Others note the presence of pyrite and shell inlays, materials that shine when struck, suggesting these inlays were placed to catch the sun at specific times of day, marking tidal cycles and aspects of seasonal light useful for timing voyages. The bearing ring could have been used to fix an angle against a sight line, aligning an offshore stack with an inland headland and thereby translating visual bearings into a reproducible method for navigation. Taken together, the atoll can look like a pedagogical space, a place where novice skippers learn the geometry of local waters through walking, pointing, and repetition. But here's where it gets tricky. Several of the ceramic shards show chemical composition linking them to distant kiln sources beyond the conventional exchange network, implying long-distance contact. And one small ingot of an alloy mixing tin, copper, and a trace of meteoritic iron was recovered from a sealed pocket beneath a central stone. Meteoritic iron in that era is rare and prized. Its presence suggests either direct long-range acquisition or elite exchange networks that moved exotic materials across vast distances. Competing theories branch out like tidal channels. A conservative reading imagines the atoll as a local innovation, a community adapting reef architecture to make sense of a confusing lagoon, embedding memory in place. In this model, the foreign materials arrived through episodic trade, passing ships dropping off exotic goods, but the reef laying itself remained an indigenous practice. A bolder theory argues for the atoll as a regional training hub for navigators operating across a swath of coastline, a coastal academy, where captains from many shores met to exchange knowledge, test bearings, and agree on shared mnemonic systems, what one proponent called a mariner lingua franca of stones and inlays. This hypothesis gains traction from the diversity of materials and the scale of the construction, which implies coordinated labor over generations. Critics respond that the labor required could have been motivated by ritual or prestige rather than pedagogy. Building large, durable structures in visible tidal zones signals control of maritime space, an assertion of sovereignty or sacred presence, rather than a map. Then there are the outlier claims that compel both eye-rolling and wide-eyed curiosity. Local oral traditions include the notion of a ledger keeper, who recorded debts and obligations of passing ships by moving small tokens between niches in the reef, an economic reading turned mythic. Another telling, older seafarers' songs transcribed in the 19th century mention the stones that remember the tide, and include a refrain about giants with long hands who walked the shallow and set the stones, an image that local storytellers have sometimes associated with the discovery of exceptionally large timbers found buried nearby in earlier centuries and misinterpreted as the remains of giant ships or creatures. The legend of giants recurs across so many coastal cultures that we must treat it carefully. Giants often operate in folklore as containers for memory of large-scale things, oversized timbers, whale bones, or even strange weather events. Yet the mythic layer cannot be dismissed because myths encode the social significance of a place. They tell us that the atoll was not simply functional but resonant, an arena where identity and memory were performed aloud. Picture yourself standing on the reef at low tide, the lagoon a sheet of mercury around you, the stones underfoot warm from the sun. A veteran captain walks before you, moving from stone to stone in rehearsed steps, his footfalls sounding like a drumbeat. He stops at a pyrite-inlaid niche and holds up a polished bone ring to align a distant stack with his sight. Then he recites the name of the channel in a low, sing-song cadence. You mimic him, your feet fall into the groove, your hands find a resin-filled incision and trace it. The pattern imprints on your body. That embodied learning is the central insight here. Maps need not be portable to be effective. They can be choreographies lived into muscle memory. Yet that image also highlights the question of scale. Who were the captains teaching on this reef? Were they local people training their own, or traveling mariners exchanging technique across cultural borders? The evidence hints at both, and both possibilities expand our sense of how knowledge moved in the ancient literal world. Technically intriguing anomalies press in again. The meteoritic iron alloy found beneath the central stone is not merely a curiosity. Metallurgical analysis shows a small inclusion of nickel and phases typical of meteoritic material, suggesting a prized object, perhaps a status marker, was deliberately interred at the atoll's center. Meteoritic iron has been used in other locales as a ceremonial material, sometimes fashioned into tools or ornaments, and imbued with cosmological significance. If such an object existed here, it might have conferred ritual weight on the atoll's navigational functions, blending the practical and the sacred. Furthermore, microstratigraphic analysis of the resin inlays shows seasonal layering, thin laminations of organic detritus that indicate reapplication over time, implying maintenance rituals. The stones were not set once and forgotten but tended, recharged, and renewed across generations. That maintenance is social evidence, regular communal labor anchored by memory and obligation. But let's be fair and scrutinize the counterarguments. Critics point out that the so-called leisure pattern could be a byproduct of practical reef consolidation. Stones laid to prevent scour can create repeating patterns and niches that later observers interpret as intentional mnemonic devices. Pyrite and shell can appear in different contexts and be moved by currents. Isotopic data can be skewed by small sample sizes and diagenetic alteration. The meteoritic signature, while suggestive, derives from a tiny inclusion that could represent a later intrusion or a stray piece transported by later currents into an older context. These are valid cautions. Archaeology rarely speaks in certainties, and the ocean environment complicates preservation and context. Still, the convergence of multiple lines of evidence, stonework, maintenance laminae, diverse ceramics, maritime residue, and oral memory, creates a pattern that resists reductive explanations. Then there is the unsettling human story revealed by excavation of a small burial mound on a low islet near the atoll. The graves contained adults with healed fractures consistent with long-term maritime labor, anatomical changes from repeated hauling and a diet heavy in marine proteins. One high-status burial included a small wooden board burnt and charred, inscribed with notches that might represent tally marks. Alongside it lay a small, flattened bronze object etched with lines that some interpret as a crude chart fragment. The ethical voice in modern archaeology urges caution in reading too much into a single find, yet the burial gestures toward a community for whom maritime practice was central to identity, and for whom recording, whether ledger-like or ritualized, mattered. The reflective insight that rises here is simple and profound. People calibrate their lives against the demands of the sea and, in doing so, make durable arrangements, stones, rituals, songs, that encode what must be remembered to survive. Maps are part of that ecology of memory. Finally, we must confront the mythic tack that refuses to be untangled, stories of a lost tribe of navigators who vanished after a storm or a conflict and left behind their stones. Some 19th century collectors, hungry for sensational narratives, conflated these tales with dubious reports of giant skeletons seen during unusual storms. Those early accounts are unreliable and tinged with exoticism. But the persistence of such stories matters because they shaped later attitudes toward the atoll, motivating salvage, looting, and sometimes protective reverence. How communities later framed the atoll, sacred site, cautionary ruin, or commercial claim, impacts what survived to the present. So myth and materiality are braided. When we reconstruct the past, we must account for both. We still don't know whether the Sunken Ledger Atoll was primarily a pragmatic training ground, a ritualized assertion of maritime control, or a cosmopolitan trading hub where navigators from distant shores collaborated and taught. We still don't know whether the meteoritic iron and distant porcelains arrived through direct voyaging or through layered exchange networks. We still don't know if the ledger metaphor, stones as entries, is more poetically apt than scientifically accurate, or whether it is literally true that passing ships left tokens in niches as a form of maritime bookkeeping. We still don't know what happened to the people who maintained the atoll, whether rising seas, violent storms, or social reconfiguration led to its decline, and whether any descendants of its keepers still tell their songs in a mutated form. The atoll gives us a landscape of questions, not conclusive answers, and that is precisely why it matters. It forces us to imagine a maritime past where knowledge is housed in stones and bodies, in resins and ritual, in movement and memory, and where maps can be as much a choreography as a drawing. The oasis waypoints, a string of freshwater springs hidden like beads along an otherwise impassable desert margin, gives us a one-sentence tease that tastes of grit and salt. Carved slabs and caches of navigational pebbles at these springs suggest desert pilots, people who mapped emptiness with a precision that looks, at first glance, like contradiction. Imagine crossing the desert and finding not only water but a deliberate system of markers. Low carved slabs set at intervals between dunes, each slab bearing depressions worn smooth by fingers and pebbles arranged in repeating counts, sometimes threes, sometimes fives, tucked into hollows where wind would not easily displace them. The waypoints stretch for nearly 80 kilometers along a corridor where the dunes funnel travelers toward a narrow coastal plain. The slabs stand between a half-kilometer and 3 kilometers apart, distances that fit the daily endurance of caravans and the arc of the sun used for rough bearings. Excavations around the largest spring uncovered hearth lamps with traces of whale oil, and a scatter of exotic beads chemically linked to coastal kills 300 kilometers away. Radiocarbon dates from charred seeds and lamp wicks cluster in the first millennium BC, and pollen records indicate this corridor was once moister, a marginal greenway where humans could plausibly maintain year-round movement. That is the initial puzzle. Why invest in a fixed system of waypoints in an environment that, by conventional chronology, should have discouraged sedentary complexity? Here's where it gets tricky. The stones themselves are not merely cairns. Many slabs show shallow star punctures that, when connected mentally, form angular guides aligning with the sun's azimuth at key seasonal points. Some slabs have grooves pointing not to the rising sun but to distant coastal peaks, line-of-sight points that can be seen from certain dune hollows on clear days. The pebbles in their hollows appear to be a counting system, a physical ledger of distance, or a mnemonic for water points and hazards, a tactile map you can carry in your palm before you set off each day. One well-preserved cache also contained a bitumen-sealed jar with folded birch bark slips whose ink had bled into illegibility. Under microscope, however, faint impressions revealed repeated symbols, dots and chevrons, matching pebble patterns on other slabs. So, we have evidence for an embodied mapping system: stones that point, pebbles that count, and perishable slips that record routes. That combination is uncanny because deserts, more than any landscape, reward mnemonic systems you can carry in your body and in objects that survive the wind. Navigation here is not only about seeing the sea on the horizon. It is about timing the sun, reading dune shadows, and remembering the distance you can cover in a day before water runs out. The slabs and pebbles are, in a sense, a distributed map of absence. They mark the safe spaces between the dangers. Scholars argue over the slabs' function. One school reads them as practical waypoints for caravans, simple, durable markers ensuring that traders, herders, and pilgrims could slip through the desert corridor without losing their lives. Another school posits a more specialized role, that these were the marks of desert pilots, a guild of navigators who moved not just goods but knowledge across the harsh margin, teaching others how to read the shifting sands as a seaman reads swell. Support for the guild hypothesis comes from the relative uniformity of the pebble codes across the 80-kilometer span and from ethnographic parallels in other deserts where secretive navigation knowledge is transmitted in kin-based apprenticeships. Yet skeptics point to the absence of high-status burials or monumental architecture that would indicate an institutionalized guild. Instead, what we find are pragmatic hearth sites, repaired slabs, and evidence of episodic rather than continuous habitation. Still, that episodic pattern may be precisely what made the system resilient. Mobile experts moving seasonally between springs to maintain waypoints, refresh caches, and teach transient groups. Mythic layers multiply. Many local poems collected from coastal and desert communities tell of the lost mariners of San, a people who knew how to read the wind in the skin of the dunes. These mariners are sometimes described as giant-faced men with long, sun-hardened hands. In other tellings they are women with eyes like polished stone who could point the way by scratching lines into rock that would not wash away. Folklorists caution us that such tales often personify a technique to make it transferable across generations, but they also remind us that the social value of navigation, who controls it, who teaches it, often becomes the subject of legends. Picture yourself approaching a spring at dusk after a day under the sun. An elder greets you and runs 2 fingers in the pebble hollows, counting quietly as he consults a birch bark slip. He hands you a small smooth pebble and tells you to hold it when you walk the next day, to feel the weight and remember the count. The intimacy of that teaching, a pebble passed from palm to palm, transforms the abstract idea of a map into a lived practice. That is the reflective insight. Maps are not only diagrams but transmitted techniques, and in marginal landscapes, those techniques are often secret, embodied, and preserved in small, seemingly mundane objects. Technological anomalies crop up again. Trace residue in the bitumen jar contained plant alkaloids consistent with coastal trade winds bringing smoked fish inland. Metallurgical fragments of a heightened bronze pin were found lodged under one slab. Tin that, in that era, was rare and suggests either long-distance trade or opportunistic acquisition through stranded voyages. There are also osteological signatures in several individuals buried near the springs, distinct spinal wear patterns consistent with people accustomed to balancing heavy loads across dunes, a signature we might expect of long-distance caravanners rather than local farmers. The convergence of bodily evidence, tiny archival slips, and pebble codes forms a strong circumstantial case for a practiced knowledge system. Yet we still do not know whether this system arose independently in the desert, was imported from coastal navigational practices and adapted to sand, or is an emergent hybrid responding to climatic shifts that made the corridor more or less passable across centuries. We still don't know whether the oasis waypoints were mainly a set of practical survival strategies developed by itinerant desert navigators or whether they formed the backbone of a sophisticated cross-margin knowledge exchange that linked coastal pilots, inland herders, and desert traders. We still don't know the degree to which the pebble codes were standardized, secret, or open, or whether the birch bark slips were private ledgers or communal mnemonic aids. We still don't know if the lost mariners of San, or a historical people whose techniques diffused and then vanished, or a mythic condensation of many small practices aggregated into story. Yet the slabs compel us to think beyond shorelines. Maps can be skeletal, distributed systems of simple markers that hold life and death information in marginal landscapes, and we ignore them at our peril. The northern silent logs, a fjord strewn with half-buried timber and placid lagoons where the bones of ships and whales intermingle, gives us a one-sentence tease that carries a cold clarity. Deep within these inlets, sailors carved not only logs of voyages but carved symbols into plank and keel, maps of sound and drift, recorded in wood and bone as if the sea itself had been ledgered. Enter the northern fjord in imagination. Towering cliffs funnel wind and swell into narrow channels. Winter fog hangs low for months. Along the shingly margins, timbers stick out of the mud like ribs. Many of these timbers are worked, notched, and sometimes inlaid with small metal tabs. A few boards bear incised marks, lines and symbols that, when compared across sites in the fjord, show consistent motifs: a spiral denoting eddy, a series of dashes for shallows, a circle for a safe anchorage. Dendrochronology from several timbers sequences them into a continuous record from about 600 BC through the early centuries CE, a remarkably long-lived maritime archive. That continuity is rare and precious. Wood preserves differently across contexts, and the survival of these logs suggests that some practices of recording the sea were both durable and valued. Detailed analysis complicates simple readings. Many of the incisions are not map-like in the abstract cartographic sense but are logs of experience, short notes about storms survived, crew names, the number of days since the last landfall, or the presence of particular birds as omens. Yet when incisions from multiple logs are compiled and compared, a system emerges, repeated sequences mapped to recurrent environmental patterns, and matching marks across widely separated logs hint at shared knowledge among dispersed crews. One provocative find was a sequence of notches on a plank that correlated with tidal bores in adjacent rivers, a counting system for timing passage through estuaries. Another plank bore a smooth depression the size and shape of a palm, suggesting it was a touchstone used by pilots to orient themselves and to calibrate the feel of the sea on particular days. These physical traces are tactile maps, logs you run your hand along to remember a route as much as you read. Scholars differ on interpretation. Some emphasize the northern silent logs as the work of a compact seafaring culture that developed wood-based logbooks for community memory, a kind of oral history written in timber. Others see them as the residue of a mercantile network where captains traded techniques via shared marks, a proto-notational system for coastal navigation in a complex archipelago. Skeptics argue about the subjectivity of symbol reading. How much are scholars imposing patterns where there may only be personal graffiti? Experimental archaeologists have tried to emulate the marks, sailing reconstructed boats and recording which marks they would find useful in practice. The results suggest that many of the marks have practical utility, but not all. That mixture of utility and personal note is the story's human center. These were people who survived by memory and who turned their survival into physical objects, compiling a collective ledger that speaks in fragments. Myth and poignancy arrive in human form. Folktales in the fjord speak of a silent captain who vowed to record every voyage on the ship's bones so that his children's children might never lose the way home. In certain versions, these logs were thought to contain the names of drowned sailors, and their incisions were read at funerals as if the wood itself were a priest. There are also persistent stories of long men of the sea, giants who could stride across shallows and drag boats ashore, and fragments of oversized bone discovered historically during peat cutting have been folded into these tales. Again, giants operate in local narrative as a metonym for oversized things, big timbers, whale bones, or unusual natural features. In the archaeological record, we can sometimes follow a chain from physical anomaly to folk memory. A large bone becomes a giant, a carved plank becomes a log of fate, and together they weave identity. Technological surprises emerge as well. High-resolution analysis of some metal inlays in the planks reveals a alloying technique that provides both corrosion resistance and a shimming function. Small tabs allow planks to be refastened and reoriented, implying a practice of updating logs and reusing material. There is evidence that some planks were deliberately retired and then repurposed as house beams, bringing maritime memory into domestic space. Imagine living in a hall where your roof beams once spiked as a ship's hull. The house remembers the sea in its very rafters. That intersection of public seafaring memory and private domestic reuse is a powerful human image. Maps and logs do not disappear with a ship sinking. They become part of new things, carrying memory forward in surprising ways. We still don't know the exact social mechanisms that maintained the northern silent logs. Were they part of kinship-based transmission, guild-like structures, or ad hoc practices among independent captains? We still don't know the degree to which these wooden logs encoded standardized navigational information versus being idiosyncratic notebooks of lived experience. We still don't know to what extent the marks influenced later documented cartographic practices in the region, or whether they represent a parallel but ultimately separate techniques of knowing the sea. What they do give us, unmistakably, is a record of resilience, people making durable memory from perishable material and learning to live by touch, by scar, by mark. And so the 6 mysteries: coastal stones that align currents like a chart, terraces that teach stars, caves that hold memory maps, atolls that stitch ledger and reef, desert waypoints that count survival, and fjord logs that record voyages, fold inward toward a larger question about maps themselves. Maps are, in this collection, not singular objects but multiplex practices, carved, danced, sung, worn into wood, hidden in pebbles, taught by elders, argued over by scholars, and mythologized by storytellers. Each site stretches our definition of what it means to map the world. Where a modern map offers scaled projection and lines of latitude, these older maps offer a different kind of precision, contextual, embodied, anchored in ritual and rehearsal. They teach us that human beings, across climates and topographies, have repeatedly externalized mental models into durable media that survive in surprising ways. When you look at a groove in a stone or a sand-hollowed pebble, you are reading a thought that once guided a hand. In this final stretch, let's pull together the threads and consider what these puzzles mean for our idea of human connectivity. First, there is the sense that technical innovation often arises at margins. Mariner's Teeth, the Starteller Terraces, and the Sunken Ledger Atoll are all liminal places, coastlines, river edges, reefs, where the demands of survival force creativity. Margins are where different lifeways, fisher and farmer, desert and shore, inland and sea, meet, and where hybrid practices emerge. When maritime knowledge moves inland, it changes form. Star charts become agricultural mnemonics. Compass motifs become ritual pointers in caves. Ledger stones become choreographed walkways on reefs. The transformation is not lost but translation. The core knowledge, how to move from place to place, how to read the environment, remains, but its expression adapts to new economies, materials, and social contexts. Second, the artifacts resist tidy teleologies. There is seldom a single cause, no simple story of seafaring technology appearing and spreading like a bright comet. Rather, the spread is patchy, contingent, and dependent on the choreography of people. A traveling captain, a marriage alliance, a displaced craftsperson, or a stranded trading vessel can all contribute to the local adoption of techniques. The mosaic of evidence, ceramics out of place, metallurgical oddities, isotopic blips, teaches us to read history as a palimpsest, layers of practice overlaid, rubbed, and rewritten. This is an epistemic humility lesson as much as an archaeological one. We must tolerate ambiguity and accommodate multiple working hypotheses. Third, the role of myth is not merely decorative. Legends of giants, mapkeepers, star-tellers, and ledger keepers are devices for encoding social memory. They preserve who had knowledge, who guarded it, and who obtained it through marriage, theft, or apprenticeship. Myths compress complexity into manageable narratives. They sanctify practices, and they mark ownership and authority. When an elder tells you a story about a giant who set the stones, they are not trying to convince you of the literal existence of giants. They are signaling that something large and foundational happened here that shapes identity. Understanding myths as mnemonic, legal, and political texts allows us to see them as part of the archive rather than its enemy. Fourth, there is the human cost and consequence of revealing such mysteries. Excavations occur in contested landscapes, and the past is not neutral property. It belongs to descendant communities whose identity and livelihoods intersect with archaeological practice. The controversies around the Starteller terraces, stones removed, protests raised, trusts rebuilt, remind us that science must be collaborative, ethically grounded, and attentive to contemporary claims. The past does not belong to scholars alone. It is living heritage, and the ways we interpret and publish findings will shape modern lives and politics. A responsible approach integrates local voices, shares insights, and treats artifacts and places with respect. Finally, there is the emotional core. Why do these mysteries grip us? Because they are mirrors that reflect our own curiosity and limitations. These sites show us people like us, people who worried about safe passage, who taught children the names of stars, who invented counting systems from pebbles, who carved maps into caves to keep the sea from being forgotten. They remind us that our ancestors were not merely passive recipients of geography. They actively remade landscapes into mnemonic devices, stitched memory into stone and wood, and turned uncertainty into shared practice. Every carved groove is an argument against the idea that pre-modern peoples were less sophisticated. Rather, their sophistication took forms adapted to materials, environments, and social imperatives we sometimes underappreciate. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with questions worth holding. We still don't know which of the many theories best explains each site. We still don't know whether there are unexcavated caches that will redefine chronology. We still don't know whether descendants of these practices survive in songs and idioms yet uncollected. But we do know this: maps are not simply drawings on paper. They are living practices that can be embedded in place, rehearsed in song, and passed palm to palm across harsh landscapes. And because maps are practices, they are vulnerable. Sea level rise, development, and looting can erase them quickly. That urgency gives an ethical charge to the work: to record carefully, to partner with communities, and to honor the multiplicity of ways people have known their worlds. Close your eyes and picture once more a sequence of scenes: the fog stones of mariners' teeth aligning like ancient compasses, the terraces where a teacher points to a carved star and whispers a name, the cave where a polished disc slides and a child's fingers learn an arc, the atoll where a learner walks the reef and traces pyrite sparkles, the desert spring where an elder presses a pebble into your palm and counts, the fjord logs whose timber keeps the names of storms like scars in wood. These are not stories of lost grandeur alone. They are the cumulative record of ordinary ingenuity, the everyday scaffolding that keeps people alive from season to season. The emotional payoff lies not in resolving every anomaly but in recognizing our shared project across millennia, people trying to know their world and to pass that knowledge forward. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.